Mold has a long and proud history. Some settlements have existed in the area from earliest times. A Bronze Age tumulus burial mound was excavated at Thlong in the 1950s, revealing a human skeleton and jet and stone necklace. The most important archaeological discovery was made in 1833 just off Chester Road, when a Bronze Age gold cape was found. It's about 3,500 years old and probably had belonged to a Bronze Age chieftain and is regarded as a fine example of Bronze Age craftsmanship and is exhibited at the British Museum, London. Close to the town are a number of Iron Age hill forts, such as Moel y Gair, Rosasmore. The Iron Age Celts were a warlike people, and these were their tribal capitals which they occupied in times of war. The banks and ditches which encircled the summit of the hills formed the defences of these strongholds, and these can still be seen, although the palisade fences which surmounted the banks have long since rotted away. According to legend, Mold is reputed to have been the site of the Alleluia victory about 447 AD, when Christian Britons defeated an army of pagan Picts and Saxons. The Britons were greatly outnumbered, but their leader, Bishop Germanus of Auxerre, told them as the enemy approached to shout out, "Alleluia, Alleluia, Alleluia." As the place where they were gathered was surrounded by hills, their voices echoed loudly. The enemy assumed that they were facing a much larger force of Britons, and they took fright and fled. Many of them were drowned in the River Alyn, or were cut down by the pursuing Britons. Although some scholars doubt that this could have been the site of the battle, the legend and claim is still strongly held locally and is commemorated by an obelisk erected in 1736 by Nehemiah Griffiths of Riel on the field opposite the Riel. St. Germanus's name is also remembered in the names of a farm, village, school and local streets. Near Mold at New Brighton can still be seen the remains of Wat's Dyke, built from near Welshpool to Basingwork on the Dee estuary by King Ethelbald, the Saxon king of Mercia, 716 to 757 AD, to mark the border between his lands and the lands of the Welsh. The dyke consists of a bank on the English side and a ditch on the Welsh side. Remains of the dyke can still be seen in New Brighton alongside the Beaufort Park Hotel. Later, on the same principle, his successor, King Offa, built an even longer dyke from Basingwork to the Bristol Channel, although no remains of this can be found in the Mold area today. The existing settlement of Mold dates from Norman times, when the Normans recognised the strategic importance of the mound site which dominates the Alyn Valley route into North Wales, and built their Mott and Bailey castle on it. This castle was probably built in 1093 AD by Robert de Montaut, the Lord of Mold. On top of the hill, a steep mound was built, and on top of it a wooden keep was erected. Beside the motte there was a bailey, a plateau area with a palisade fence, bank and ditch around it to defend it from attack. Inside this bailey there were living quarters, stables and workshops. If the bailey fell to an enemy in an attack, the defenders could withdraw by means of a drawbridge to the keep on the motte. The outline of the earthworks which formed the Mott and Bailey can still be seen on the Bailey Hill, an area of parkland in the centre of the town. It's thought that the name of Mold is derived from the Norman lord's lands in Normandy, Montaut. But it could also be from Mons Alto, meaning the high mountain. Gwythgrig, the Welsh name for the town, also means the mound, and probably both names relate to the hill on which the Mott and Bailey was built. The castle featured in the 200 years of warfare which took place between the Welsh, the Normans, and then English kings. The Welsh did not accept the encroachment on their land by Norman and English invaders, and the town was hotly contested. It was seized by Owain Gwynedd in 1145, only to be recaptured in 1157 by Henry II. Later, in 1199, Llywelyn Fawr the Great recaptured the castle and held it until his death in 1240. After the conquest of Wales by Edward I, the Montauts were made more secure in their lordship and held it until the last of the Montauts died in 1329. The lordship then changed hands a number of times until it was finally settled on Sir Thomas Stanley, and the Stanleys became Lords of Mold, as well as Harden, and Lords of Man, and owners of large tracts of land in Lancashire. Despite the comparative peace following the conquest, the border areas, or the Marcher lordships as they were known, were areas of turbulence and lawlessness, which was also characterised by animosity between the English and Welsh. This is demonstrated by a well-known story concerning Reinald ap Griffith ap Lethin of the Tower Nerquis. He was on bad terms with the citizens of Chester, and in 1465 a fight took place between his followers and some Chester men at the fair in Mold. Several Chester men, including Robert Burn, a linen draper and the mayor of Chester, were taken captive to the Tower. Burn was offered dinner and a pie was produced, but when the crust was removed, it revealed a coiled rope with which he was promptly hanged by his captors. When the news of the mayor's fate reached Chester, a party was organised to avenge the death of their mayor. However, as this force approached the Tower, lookouts warned Reinald, and he and his men left the Tower and hid in the woods nearby. When the Chester men entered the Tower in search of Reinald and his followers, they crept out of their hiding place, locked the doors on them, and set fire to the house. The old mansion, the Tower, can still be seen on the Mold to Nerquis Road. The Tower is a fine example of a fortified manor house of the period, which marks the transition from castle to manor house, as times became a little more settled and people felt a little more secure, if not entirely so. As times became more settled, a town grew up around the castle. A church was probably one of the first buildings to be erected. The present church, probably the second on this site, is a splendid monument to the Stanleys and was built by Margaret Beaufort, the mother of Henry Tudor, who'd married Lord Thomas Stanley, her third husband, in 1482. The church was built as a thanks offering to God for her son's great victory over Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth, 1485, by which he won the crown of England. After some hesitation and caution, Lord Stanley, no doubt with men from Mold in his army, had joined in the battle on Henry's side, and it was Lord Stanley's brother, Sir William Stanley, who'd picked up Richard's fallen crown and crowned Henry Tudor, King Henry VII, on the battlefield. Henry founded the great Tudor dynasty, which produced such famous monarchs as Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. The church building was begun about 1490 and took about 100 years to complete. It's built in the Perpendicular style of architecture and is remarkable for its ornamentation and the richness of its heraldic decorations. The emblems of the Stanleys, such as the eagle and child, eagle's claw, and the three legs of man, can be seen throughout the church. The Lady Chapel roof is original. The tower was added in 1773. Until then, the tower of the old church had continued to serve the church. The crudely carved faces on the wall of the Bailey Hill in Pulth glass are probably from this earlier tower. The church was restored in 1856 by Sir George Gilbert Scott, who added the apsidal chancel and new nave and south aisle roof. The old gallery and box pews were also removed, and the new pews with finely carved poppy heads were installed, together with the pulpit and choir and clergy stalls, the work of a talented local craftsman, Thomas Edwards. The existing statue of the Virgin and Child in the exquisitely carved 15th century niche in the Lady Chapel dates from the 1920s, but it's believed that it originally held a figure known as Othello View, living image. In pre-Reformation times, Mold Church was famous for this statue of the Virgin Mary, or the Virgin and Child, which was reputed to have spoken, made signs, or performed some miracles. The Welsh poet Lewis Glyn Cothi sings its praises, and pilgrimages were made to it. At the time of the Reformation, there was a reaction against pilgrimages to such statues, which was regarded as idolatry, and they were removed from many churches and smashed. This was probably the fate of much of the original glass, only fragments of which now remain and have been pieced together in one of the south aisle windows. Most of the stained glass in the church today was installed in the late 19th century, such as the chancel windows made by William Wales of Newcastle upon Tyne about 1865. Following the Reformation and the Acts of Union 1536 and 1542, the local gentry families prospered, and this is reflected in the fine mansions they built for themselves. Pentre Hobin, built by the Lloyds in 1540, Gousani, built by the Davis family in 1545, Plas Teg, built by Sir John Trevor in 1610, and Rial, built by Evan Evans in 1634. During the English Civil War, 1642-49, a parliamentary force under Sir William Brereton had marched on Gousani Hall on Good Friday, 1645. The hall was lightly defended by its royalist owner Robert Davis and 27 other defenders. The hall soon fell to the attackers, and Robert Davis and his men were taken prisoner to Chester. The front door of the hall was damaged in the siege, and it's claimed that the repairs which were necessary can still be seen today. Although many of the older buildings have disappeared over the years, the street scene in most of the main streets of the town remain very much the same, and the streets and a number of buildings are still easily recognizable. This is one of the earliest photographs of the High Street, taken in 1861. The parish church can be seen dominating the top of the town, as it still does today. The large building on the right was T. Mower, Big House, built about 1725 by Sir George Wynne of Leeswood Hall as a townhouse for his family. Lower down on the right-hand side stood the Black Lion Hotel, an old coaching inn. One of the distinctive features of the lower High Street is its width, a feature which was probably to accommodate the fairs and street markets. This photograph shows the cross in about 1870. The fountain and clock which occupied the centre of the cross was erected in 1864 in memory of Prince Albert, the late husband of Queen Victoria. The fountain and clock were removed in 1884 because it was regarded as a traffic hazard and a resort for idlers. This High Street scene dates from about 1910 and is taken from the cross. It was a market day, and the traders are trading from their carts rather than stalls, as they do today. You can see the Star Hotel on the right with its dormer windows, and the glazed canopies which adorned the county supply stores and the adjacent property from the 1880s and remained a feature of the High Street until the early 1960s. One of the shops in the middle of this side of the High Street was J. Saulmes, watchmaker and jeweller. Later on, Saulmes also became opticians. It traded in this location until the early 1960s. Between Saulmes and the Black Lion was Oliver's Boot and Shoe Shop, as pictured here in about 1910. It remained in business until the 1970s. This picture of the High Street is dated about 1920 and is taken from the corner with King Street. You can see the edge of 24 High Street and next door the old Midland Bank, then the Cambrian Public House. On the cross you can see some black and white buildings which were demolished and replaced with the current buildings in 1929. For many years, the site on the corner of High Street and New Street housed the old Leet Court, which was the venue for both the Manor Court and the visiting Assize Courts. The Old Town Stocks used to be situated in front of the building and was where summary punishment was administered for offenders. By the early 19th century, the building had become dilapidated. A new courthouse was built and the building on the cross was demolished in 1845, and the Mould Market Company built a new indoor market hall to provide a permanent home for some of the butchers' and grocers' street stalls. The ground floor remained the town's indoor market until 1976. The floor above was the assembly hall, and for many years it provided the venue for theatrical productions, concerts, lectures, Eisteddfods, balls, meetings, and was the home of the first cinema in the days of the silent movies. It also served as the town hall until the new town hall was built in 1912. An additional third floor was added to the building in 1874 to provide a library and reading room, which was run by the Mould Cosmopolitan Society. It was also home to the Mould Liberal Association. The third story spoiled the symmetry of the building, and it was removed when the building was renovated in 1984. This photograph, dating from the 1940s, shows on the left the black and white building, the Market Vaults Public House. Next on the left was Melius Grocery Shop, and next Pugh the Butchers, followed by Bell's the Grocers, Owen Roberts Tailors, the Central Cafe, the Cambrian Public House, the Midland Bank, 24 High Street, and then another black and white building, Manchester House, which was Mrs. Roberts' drapery shop. This is a photograph of the Upper High Street in about 1906, looking towards the Bailey Hill. Note the horses and carts. You can see the Limes at the very top of the street, which was a private girls' school at the time and is now occupied by Keane and Kelly solicitors. To the lower right shows the end of the last property of the buildings which once lined the Upper High Street between this point and the entrance to the church. In the 1920s and 30s it was Evans and then Bithel's Sweet and Tobacconist's shop. The black and white building to the immediate left is the Dolphin Hotel. This photograph from the 1950s shows the same area of the Upper High Street from the other direction. You can see the three-story buildings which lined the street on the right of the picture. The end building was by this time Thompson's Sweet and Tobacconist's shop. By this time the building with the Brannan sign was occupied by the Bryn Griffith Working Men's Club, and the Supreme Fish and Chip Shop was next door. The old Working Men's Club building was demolished in the 1960s and replaced by a new building down Milford Street. Some other properties which once occupied the Upper High Street were Goualia House, 61 High Street, a tobacconist and sweet shop in the 1900s. The same property in the early 50s was Frost's Antique Shop. In the mid-1950s, the Liverpool Arms Public House and Willie Consul's, a watch and clock repairer. Further along was a derelict property, then Alexander's Top Shop, which sold toys and novelties, and next door was Mrs. Irene Peters, the photographer, her house, and then Thompson's Sweet and Tobacconists. W. Bellis Fishmonger and Greengrocer. Mr. Bellis was a familiar figure standing outside his shop in his cloth cap and brown overall. This photograph of 1958 shows the actual demolition of the old properties in front of the church. They'd been due for demolition in the late 1930s, but the outbreak of World War II had delayed this work. This is a picture of Chester Street in about 1907. In those days, Hunters, the tea men, occupied the first building on the right, and they were in business until the 1950s. The next building on the right was the auction rooms owned by Charlie Adams. This is also a picture of Chester Street from the cross in about 1905. You can see the Grosvenor Hotel on the corner on the left, which was a pub until the 1960s. This picture shows the old post office, which was an imposing building in Chester Street. It was built in the 1900s with the original telephone exchange above it, which is shown here as it was in the 1960s. It was demolished in 1960 to make room for the new telephone exchange. Another building next door to the post office was the Savoy Cinema, built in 1926. This photograph was taken in the early 1970s. There was a shop on either side of the cinema. The one on the left used to be a sweet shop kept by two sisters, Harriet and Anne Jane Roberts, and later by Selby's newsagents and sweet shop, and the one to the right was Alwyn's the hairdressers. Sadly, this building was also demolished in 1975 to accommodate an extension to the telephone exchange. This is a photograph of New Street taken about 1910. On the right is the Cross Keys Public House, now the Pentan. Next door was J.K. Williams and was formerly the tailor's shop owned by Daniel Owen. In 1946, it was taken over by Mr. Glyn Towyn Jones. It's now been incorporated into the Pentan Public House. Further down the street on the right-hand side, with the lantern light on the wall, was the Royal Oak Public House. This is a picture of the left-hand side of New Street taken in the 1950s. Blundell's occupied the first shop that can be seen. They sold bicycles and prams. Next door was Beatrice Jones, a drapery shop, and then there was Eric Bradburn, the butcher's shop, then Frank Maddox, the barber, and Vipon's, a newsagent's and toy shop. Next door was Edward Davis, baker's and confectioner's shop, followed by a hardware and ironmonger's shop owned by G.P. Hughes, known locally as Bill the Bowler. Next came Cook's shoe shop and then Ellis's grocers. There was then a row of 2 up and 2 down cottages, and then Bethesda Chapel, which was set back from the road. This is a photograph of Wrexham Street taken in 1909. The walls along the right-hand side are the walls of the properties in Marlow Terrace. The building with a lantern light outside is the Leeswood Arms. The cottages to the immediate left have long since been demolished, and the site is now occupied by the ex-Servicemen's Club. The building on the right with a tall chimney was a blacksmith's smithy. This photograph was taken about 1905 from the corner with Glanravon, looking towards the cross. The wall of the Britannia Public House is on the immediate left. This photograph, taken in the early 1900s, shows Wrexham Street from the corner with Grosvenor Street, looking towards the cross. The building on the left with the iron balcony was the Free Trade Hall, and the building to the right was known as Dufferin House. This second picture was taken in the 1950s. On the immediate left was Henshaw's bicycle shop, followed by a florist's. Glazier's furniture store now occupied the Free Trade Hall. Next door to it was Barkworth's, the fishmonger's, then Winter's, the jeweller's, followed by Jones Brimbo, a draper's shop, and then Meredith Jones, the newsagent's on the cross. You can see the assembly hall with its 3rd story and the siren on the very top of it. This had been used to warn of air raids during the Second World War, and for many years after to call the voluntary firemen to the fire station to man the fire engine. The black and white building to the right was J.P. Jones, baker and confectioner's shop. This is a photograph of King Street in 1967. The wall of the Black Lion Yard is on the right-hand side, with the ambulance and fire stations set back and next to it. Lower down on the right are the old education offices. On the left-hand side you can see Llewellyn Jones and Armand Ellis's, the solicitors' offices. Next door is Wade's Cafe, now Binelli's Cafe. Behind the railings is the yard of the old VP school. This photograph shows the old education offices in King Street as they looked soon after they were built in the 1900s. This photograph shows the old National School, later known as the VP School, in 1962. The school building was set back from the road and was demolished to create a car park in the early 1970s. The imposing new town hall was built in 1911. It was a gift from Mr. Peter E. Roberts of Bromfield Hall. He'd made his money in the rubber industry in Manchester, but returned to live in Mold and was a chairman of the Mold Urban District Council. As well as providing a council chamber, it also had a lecture room and housed the town's library and reading room. It was the home of the Mold Urban District Council until local government reorganisation in 1974, and is now the home of the Mold Town Council and the local credit union. This is a photograph of the county buildings. The building in the centre of the picture was built in 1858 as a county militia barracks. In 1897, the new Flintshire County Council took them over as its headquarters, and it remained as such until the new Shire, now County Hall, was built at Llwynegrin in 1967. The site of the old hall and the other county buildings is now occupied by the Mold bus station. Also situated in the hall fields was the old County Hall, built in 1834 by the local gentry to accommodate the quarter sessions and assize courts, which had formerly met at the old Leet Court on the Cross. It served as a courthouse until the late 1960s, when the new law courts were built near the County Hall. In 1877, a cottage hospital was opened in Pulth Glass. This red brick building was supported by voluntary contributions and was supervised by a committee of local worthies and a nurse. It was welcome in a town where accidents in mines and other industries were commonplace. This hospital was eventually replaced with a new community hospital built on land behind it in 1984, with access from Ash Grove. In 1870, a new model county jail was built just off the Mold to Ruthin road to replace the old jail in Flint. It had a treadmill as part of the punishment regime for prisoners and other up-to-date features. However, in 1878, the Home Office took over responsibility for all prisons, and it was closed. It was bought as a Jesuit college and was known as St. David's. During the First World War, it was used as a military detention centre, and later it became a convent school and laundry run by nuns. Now only the imposing warden's house remains as a private residence, along with the old, very high prison walls to the rear. Mold was a market town from earliest times. Fairs and markets were held where people from the surrounding area would come into town to buy and sell produce like cheese, butter and eggs, animals and fowl. These photographs from the 1890s and 1900s show how the farmers would trade directly from their carts parked alongside the high street. Later on, these were replaced by stalls, as shown in these photographs. As they came to buy and sell these goods, they would also want to buy other goods too, so this provided an opening for other traders to open shops to sell their goods. The cattle market on Mondays and Fridays and the street markets on Wednesdays and Saturdays are still important today and draw in traders and customers from a wide area and help to secure the town's importance and vitality as a trading and commercial centre. The 18th and 19th centuries, the age of the Industrial Revolution, witnessed the development of Mold as a mining and manufacturing town. First of all, lead was mined in the area surrounding Mold, and even in the 17th century, the Grosvenor family established 3 water-powered rolling mills on the River Allen at Lead Mills, and this area of the town still bears that name today. In the early 18th century, Sir George Wynne of Leeswood made a fortune from a rich lead vein on his land on Holkin Mountain, and built himself the stately Leeswood Hall on the profits. The hall is renowned for its gates made by Robert and Thomas Davis of Bersham. In 1835, there were offices of 9 lead mining companies in the town, and lead mining continued to be important locally well into the 20th century, at places such as Cadol, Gwenamanath, Panabearth and Llynapandi, until the closure of the Holkin lead mine in the 1960s. In 1792, 2 Manchester men, Samuel and James Knight, set up a cotton mill between the River Allen and Denby Road, where the Synthite Works now stand. By 1820, it was employing 300, many of whom were women and children. The mill was originally water-powered, with water from the River Allen being diverted to a huge holding reservoir formed in a specially diked field, which can still be seen and is still known as the Factory Pool Field. This water was then channeled into a mill race to drive a water wheel to power the spinning machines and weaving looms. A steam engine was later introduced to augment the power from the water wheel. The mill survived a slump in the 1850s and then the cotton famine during the American Civil War, only to be burned down in a disastrous fire in 1866. The result of this catastrophe caused much unemployment and hardship in the town. Eventually, the site was taken over in 1876 by Morgan's Tin Plate Works, and later by the Allen Tin Plate Company, which can be seen in this photograph. It employed many local men and women, some of whom can be seen in this photograph taken in about 1881. The works continued in production until 1938. The most important industry in the 19th century and early 20th century was the coal industry. In 1835, there were 7 collieries at work, including the Bromfield, Mold Town, the Rheda Galed, and the Argoed collieries. In 1837, the Argoed colliery was the scene of a flooding disaster in which 31 miners were drowned, and among them was the father and 2 brothers of Daniel Owen, the Welsh novelist. Often men and boys were killed in underground explosions and from foul air in what was a very dangerous job. Families robbed of the breadwinners by such accidents had to endure great hardships. Coal mining posed other risks too. The new county hall, built in 1833, was nearly wrecked by subsidence caused by the nearby Mould Town colliery, and a grand Gothic lantern tower on the roof of the building had to be dismantled to reduce the pressure on the walls, which had to be strengthened with rods, screws and braces to secure the building. The Industrial Revolution, while bringing much-needed jobs for local people, also resulted in social and industrial unrest. The most serious example occurred in June 1869 with the Mould Riot, which followed the jailing of 2 miners found guilty of assaulting the underground manager at the Leeswood Coal Company, who the miners blamed for reducing their pay. Miners and their families surrounded the courthouse, and soldiers from Chester were called to help the police. As the police and soldiers were escorting the prisoners to the station for transfer to Flint jail, they were pelted with stones and several were injured. Eventually, the soldiers opened fire on the rioters and 4 people were killed, 2 of them women, and 20 were wounded. This drawing, which appeared in the London Illustrated News 1869, captures the scene of the riot at its height and shows quite clearly the old railway buildings and the soldiers opening fire on the rioters. More troops were drafted into the town to help to deter further disturbances. A number of the rioters were later arrested and put on trial for their part in the riot. 5 were sentenced to 10 years hard labour. In the late 19th century, Mould, as the county town of Flintshire, became the headquarters of the new Flintshire County Council. Its first home was in the old county buildings in the County Hall Fields. Initially, the county was run by a few paid officials, but in time, as the powers and responsibilities of the county council grew, the numbers employed also increased, until it became the biggest employer in the town. The new Shire Hall was built on the land of the old Llwynegrin Hall in 1967 to accommodate its staff. After local government reorganisation in 1974, it became the county town of Clwyd, which covered the whole of North East Wales and an even larger local employer. The building was greatly extended after 1974. Following the next local government reorganisation in 1996, the renamed County Hall became the headquarters of the reconstituted but smaller County of Flintshire and continues to employ many local people. As the county town of Flintshire, Mould was also the headquarters for the Flintshire Constabulary, founded in 1856. This also provided jobs for local people maintaining law and order in the area. These photographs taken outside the old courthouse show the officers and constables of the local force in 1892 and 1908. In addition, Mould had its own fire brigade, as this photograph shows, although in those days it would have been made up entirely of volunteers who had other jobs. In 1950, the Synthite Chemical Works opened on the former tin plate works and cotton mill site in Denby Road. Here, formaldehyde is still produced. In the late 1960s and early 70s, Mould Urban District Council and later Delyn Borough Council established the Bromfield Industrial Estate on the site of the former coal tips of the Bromfield Colliery, which were cleared for the purpose using derelict land clearance grants from the government. Light industrial units were built and were occupied by small-scale light industries, which helped to provide a range of jobs for local people. Later on, further space for such light industrial units has been provided on the site of the old coal tips of the Broncoid Colliery. In this sense, new industry is rising like a phoenix from the ashes on recycled brownfield sites to replace the old defunct industries which once served the town. The Industrial Revolution also had an impact on transport, as goods produced and purchased had to be delivered to markets throughout the country and even abroad. Up to that time, roads had been the responsibility of the parish and were generally very poor. In the 18th and early 19th century, companies called turnpike trusts were set up by businessmen and landowners to take over responsibility for rebuilding and maintaining lengths of road and recouping their expenditure by charging road users tolls, which were payable at toll gates, such as this one at Llwynegrin Mould. Soon, good turnpike roads linked Mould with Chester, Wrexham, Northop and Ruthin. When the extension to Woolworths was built some years ago, an old well was found in the rear yard. No doubt this had provided water for the coach horses as they were watered, fed and rested before continuing their journeys. Travellers and letters were also picked up at these coaching inns. These photographs depict the way Mold people used to travel and carry goods in the days of horse-drawn transport, which remained important well into the early decades of the 20th century. In 1849, the Chester to Mold railway line was opened and was extended to Denbigh in 1869. The new transport system itself gave new employment opportunities for station masters, train drivers, firemen, guards, porters, ticket sellers, as well as providing an impetus to local industries which could now transport their goods more easily and quickly to any parts of the country. The railway remained open as a passenger line until the Beeching cuts of the early 1960s, and remained open for goods traffic to the Synthite Works and to Riamuin Ministry of Supply Depot well into the 1970s. The old station was then taken over by Mold Builder Supplies until it was bought by Tesco's, who demolished the old buildings and built a supermarket store in the site in the late 1980s. This modern work of art in Chester Street, provided by Aldi's supermarket chain, celebrates the age of steam and the railway which once served the town. From about 1905, omnibus transport began to compete with the railways. The first buses were privately operated. This particular bus used to take local girls and women to Messrs. Courtauld's rayon mills, Flint. By 1919, the Crossville Motor Company started bus services in Mold, and in 1923 they opened a bus depot and garage in Chester Road, Mold. Before long, they'd driven most of the other companies and operators out of business. Crossville dominated the local bus services until the 1990s. The old bus stations used to be situated on either side of Chester Street, close to the bridge over the railway line. A new bus station was built in the 1980s between Chester Street and King Street, following the demolition of the old county buildings and education offices. The arrival of the omnibus as a means of transport also opened up the possibility of day trips to the countryside and to the coast. Often these took the form of works outings, Sunday school trips or bank holiday outings, which people saved up for and looked forward to in the days when holidays with pay were not even a pipe dream. For much of the town's history, the only church in the town was the parish church dedicated to St. Mary the Virgin. Until the Reformation of the 1530s, it was a Roman Catholic church. After the break with Rome under King Henry VIII, it became an Anglican Protestant church to which all citizens were expected to attend. For many years there were penalties for those who did not. However, in Mold, as elsewhere, there were those who continued to cling to the old Catholic faith, as well as Protestant dissidents for whom the Anglican Church was not Protestant enough. An interesting feature dating from these times can be seen on the land at the Rial, where in the 17th century a former owner, Thomas Edwards, allowed the Baptists of Wrexham and Flintshire to build a baptistry, where they could administer baptism by total immersion in relative seclusion. It was the 19th century which saw the flowering of religion and of non-conformity in Wales. In Mold, as elsewhere, this was reflected in a fever of chapel building by all denominations, both the English and Welsh-speaking branches. Pendreaf Chapel was built by the Welsh Wesleyan Methodists in 1827 to 28. The chapel still stands and is a listed building with an ashlar facade with a circular petalled panel. The building now serves an evangelical group known as King's Church. In 1827, the Welsh Congregationalists built Bethel Chapel in New Street. This red brick and stone building was demolished in 1983 and replaced with a new modern building. In 1863, the English Congregationalists built a Gothic-style church in Tuthin Street, which was known locally as the Free Church. In this photograph taken in about 1890, the church had a spire, which has since been removed. The building still stands and is now known as the Tuthin Street Church, after the merger of the United Reformed Church and English Presbyterians. Also in 1863, in New Street, the Welsh Calvinistic Methodists built the imposing Bethesda Chapel with its Corinthian portico and decorated capital columns. The new chapel replaced an earlier one in Pontowyl, which is shown in this drawing. The Welsh novelist Daniel Owen worshipped at Bethesda. This is also a listed building and continues to serve what today is known as the Welsh Presbyterian Church. In 1863, the Roman Catholics built a church and school dedicated to St. David in Forth Vine to serve the growing Catholic population. Previously, Mass had been said in hired rooms. The old St. David's Church was very small, and by the 1950s, the congregation had long since outgrown the building. A new church was eventually built and opened in 1964. The Anglicans built a new church, St. John's, in King Street in 1877 for Welsh-speaking parishioners. It continued to perform that function until the early 1950s. It was then converted into a church hall, and it's still used today for that purpose. The Welsh Baptists erected a new chapel, Ebenezer, in Wrexham Street in 1880 to replace an earlier chapel in Glanravon. This old building still stands, but is no longer a church because a new church on the corner of Glanravon and the park was built in 1984 because the congregation had long outgrown the old church. Churches and chapels were a focal point for much of the religious and social life of the town. Most of the churches had strong and active Sunday schools, which remained a feature of religious life in the town well into the 1950s and 60s, and several survive to this day. Coupled with the religious revival in the 19th century, there were also major developments in education, which arose largely from the same motives, to save men and women for Christ. The Anglicans and Nonconformists vied for the hearts and minds and souls of children of the local inhabitants. A charity school founded by the Reverend Hugh Lloyd and associated with the parish church had been established behind the church in 1742 and can be seen in this picture to the left of the church. In 1849, a new national school had been built in King Street by the Church of England to replace an earlier school which had been situated in Pontowyl since 1820. It had boys, girls and infants departments. It was later known as the Voluntary Primary School, and this photograph was taken in its centenary year in 1949. It continued to serve the community until 1967, when the new Bryn County Primary School was opened in Clayton Road, and the church lost its connection with the school. In 1845, a British school was built by the Nonconformists in Glanravon. After the 1870 Education Act, this school was taken over by a local board and became known as the Board School. After 1902, it was formally known as the Council School, as it was run by the new County Council, and after 1944, it was called the County Primary School. In 1961, this building became Ysgol Glanravon, a Welsh medium county primary school, when the English medium county primary school moved to new premises in Bryn Lane. This old building can still be seen in Glanravon and now serves as a county youth theatre and expressive arts centre. The St. David's Roman Catholic School was established in 1863 alongside St. David's Church. A new Roman Catholic primary school was built in St. David's Lane in two phases in 1961 and 1965. In the closing years of the 19th century, the Allen County School was opened initially as a private school in King Street, but later moved to Bromfield and in 1886 to Preswalva in Hendy Road. The school then moved in 1899 into newly built premises in Victoria Road. It became the county school following the Welsh Secondary Education Act of 1902. In order to gain admission to this school, pupils had to pass a scholarship at the age of 11, and even then, because fees had to be paid by parents for books and uniforms, the prospect of taking up a place at the county school was out of the reach of many pupils from poor families. For such pupils, and those who failed the scholarship, there was no alternative but to stay on in the primary schools until they reached the school leaving age of 14. A new modern secondary school, or central school, was built on the Broncoed Park area in order to accommodate these older pupils who did not go to the county school. It opened in 1937. After the passage of the 1944 Education Act, the county school became the grammar school, and all fees were abolished. Children who passed the 11+ examination were now able to take up their place in the grammar school, where they followed more academic courses, while those who did not pass went to the modern secondary school, where they followed more practical and commercial courses to equip them for industrial, agricultural and clerical jobs. The modern secondary school in the 1960s was renamed Ysgol Daniel Owen. Following the adoption of comprehensive education in Flintshire in 1967, Ysgol Daniel Owen was merged with the Allen Grammar School to form the Allen High School. Now, all pupils at 11 transferred from the local primary schools to the same secondary school. For the first few years, the school operated on the sites of the former schools until the Daniel Owen building was extended and remodelled to accommodate all the pupils. The former grammar school building was remodelled and refurbished and was taken over by Bryn Coch CP School. This then enabled the Glanravon Welsh Medium Primary School to be moved into the more modern former Bryn Coch building. In 1961, a Welsh medium secondary school was opened on land off Conway Street to provide a continuation of Welsh education for those pupils who'd received their primary education at Ysgol Glanravon. Mould men and women have played their part in all the conflicts which have affected Britain since the earliest of times. At the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, between 1899 and 1902, Britain was engaged in the Boer War. This photograph shows the celebrations in Mould upon the relief of Mafeking, and this one shows the welcome home given to the soldiers who survived the conflict. There is no memorial as such to those who died in the Boer War, but the original trees which line the High Street were planted in their memory. When the First World War broke out in August 1914, again the men of Mould volunteered to fight for king and country against Germany and Turkey. This photograph shows local territorial soldiers of the 5th Battalion of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers in 1913-14 about to leave from Mould railway station for training camp. 1 million men were killed in great battles such as the Somme, Ypres and Gallipoli. A memorial chapel, the Lady Chapel, was created in the parish church, and marble stones bear the names of all who fell in the war. It's said that the black and white marble floor design of the chapel represents the trench system of the Western Front. In the early 1920s, a town cenotaph was erected at the entrance to the Bailey Hill, with the names of those who died in the war inscribed upon it. This became the focal point of the town's annual Armistice Day or Remembrance Day parade and service. In September 1939, Britain was again at war with Germany, and later with Italy and Japan. Once again, local men and women were called up to serve in the armed forces. On the home front, men in reserved occupations, and women in particular, were employed in the manufacture of war materials. Vickers Armstrong had opened an aircraft factory at Broughton in 1938, and the workforce there produced Wellington and later Lancaster bombers for the Royal Air Force. At Rhydymwyn, ICI had built a factory just before the war, and this was involved in the production of ammunition and poison gas, just in case the Germans used such chemical weapons again. Much of the materials produced in the factory were stored in underground tunnels. The relative safety of the town meant that it received numbers of children evacuated from Liverpool to escape the worst effects of the Blitz. These evacuees were mainly allocated to local families. Some of these evacuees never returned to Merseyside after the war. Once again, many local people lost their lives in the war. Their names have also been inscribed on the cenotaph and are remembered still each year on the Sunday nearest to the 11th of November. For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, most ordinary people had very little free time for leisure and entertainment because most of their time was spent in earning a living. What little free time they had was occupied with simple pleasures and do-it-yourself entertainment. As the work was long, hard and hot in the pit and in the tin works, many men gravitated to the pub to quench their thirst and try to escape from the realities of their hard lives. Mold had a great many more pubs in those days than it has today, even though the population is much bigger now. Hard drinking was a problem, as these men earned very little money and could easily squander their hard-earned wages in bouts of drinking, particularly on payday. Of course, it was the wives and children who suffered most as a consequence, for there would be nothing to live on for the next week. Mold also had an orchestra where young and old would come together to make music. This orchestra was a feature until the 1914 war. In accordance with Welsh tradition, the Eisteddfod was also a feature of everyday life, and men and women, boys and girls would spend months preparing for local Eisteddfodau. A local Eisteddfod was held in the Assembly Hall for many years. Mold also played host to the National Eisteddfod of Wales in 1873, 1923, and more recently in 1991. There were amateur theatrical and opera groups who would rehearse for many months and put on performances at the Assembly Hall. Mrs. or Madame Mary Maud Douglas Adams was a leading light in these productions in the late 19th century. She was a retired opera singer. The Mold Amateur Operatic and Dramatic Society was formed about 1909 and flourished for many years. Local football was also a great attraction both for the players and the supporters of the local teams. There were several local clubs, such as the Mold Town Football Club, the Mold Allyn Swifts, the Allyn Wanderers and Mold Albions. Mold Alexandra Football Club still represents the town. Mold also had its cricket club, as it still does. It probably dates from about 1866. There also appears to have been a ladies' cricket team in the 1890s. Mold Cricket Ground and Clubhouse is situated in Chester Road. The Mold Rugby Club was formed in the 1930s but fell into abeyance, was revived in the 1960s and is now a thriving club with its ground and clubhouse in Chester Road, Mold. Crown Green Bowling was also very popular. Mold Subscription Bowling Club was a private club which played on a small green behind the Dolphin Hotel. For the youngsters, there were organisations such as Guides, Brownies, Cubs and Scouts. The Mold Carnival was a major local attraction for many years, and people and groups would be engaged for many months planning and organising the event, which would raise money for local charities. The carnival has been revived in recent years. For many years, the old Assembly Hall served as a local cinema in the days of the silent movies. The best seats were on the stage. The films were accompanied by a pianist who played background music to suit the various scenes in the film. In 1926, a purpose-built cinema, the Mold Savoy, was opened in Chester Street. It was a single-storey building, but with a sloping floor towards the screen, and with the more elevated best seats, the 1 and 9s, in the back, and the cheaper sixpennies at the front. The Savoy played a large part in the lives of the youth of the town and the surrounding villages. In the 1950s, 60s and 70s, the Assembly Hall was the venue for the local teenage dances organised by Mold Urban District Council. Probably its greatest claim to fame in these years was that the Beatles performed there in October 1962, just after they'd made their first #1 hit. In the late 1950s and 1960s, EM's Snack Bar was also a great attraction with the teenagers because it had a jukebox with all the latest pop records. Teenagers would spend hours in there, particularly on Saturdays and during the school holidays, listening to pop music and making 1 cup of coffee last all afternoon. In 1974, the Mold Sports Centre was opened. It was built as a joint project by the then Flintshire County Council, Mold Urban District Council and Holywell Rural District Council. In 1976, Clwyd County Council opened Theatre Clwyd on the outskirts of the town. As well as providing a purpose-built theatre with its own nationally recognised production company, it also had a small film theatre and gallery for exhibitions. Over the years, the theatre has staged some outstanding productions, and some of the best-named actors and actresses have appeared on its stage, such as Anthony Hopkins, Vanessa Redgrave, and Eileen Atkins. With the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century and the development of the coal mines, cotton mill and later the tin plate works, the population increased and new houses had to be built, and built quickly, to house the industrial workers and their families. These were 2 up and 2 down back-to-back terraced houses typical of the industrial towns of England and Wales. Rows such as Garden Place, Cross Row, Long Row, Chapel Row, Pownall's Row, Allyn Terrace and Bromfield Row were built to house industrial workers. They initially had no running water, and water had to be collected from a communal well or pump. The toilets in the yard were just a plank of wood with a hole in it and a hole in the ground beneath it. Many of these properties have since been demolished in slum clearance programs in the last 50 to 60 years, but a number have survived and since been completely renovated and modernised with grant-aided schemes, for example in Stanley Street, Chapel Street, Gladstone Street, Water Street and Price's Row. Houses were also built in the 19th century to house the new middle class of industrialists and business people. The Mount in Denby Road, for example, was built by William Pring of Pring and Price Printers, and was later the home of Josiah Morgans, son of Morgan Morgans, joint owner of the tin plate works. Daniel Owen built a new home for himself, Caer Ffynnon in Maes y Dre, on the proceeds of his successful books. Bank Villas was built in 1885 to house the business and professional people of the town. Some interesting Art Deco properties are to be found in Gwenaffield Road. These flat-roofed houses were built in the late 1930s for managers and other key workers at the new ICI works at Rhydymwyn. In addition to their distinctive style, other interesting features include very thick walls and roofs and attached shelters with steel shutters for the windows as a protection from aerial bombing should there be war. As part of the slum clearance schemes both before and after the Second World War, new housing estates were built by the council to accommodate those who needed rehousing and the growing population. These council houses were 2, 3 or even 4-bedroomed houses and had hot and cold running water, bathrooms, toilets and substantial gardens at the front and back. The first council houses to be built in Mold were in Alexandra Road and Ambrose Terrace in 1919. Followed by others such as Drevlan. Following the Second World War, new council houses were built in Park Allen and Bromley Estate. The 1950s saw the development of Queen's Park. With the new prosperity of the 50s and 60s, more houses were built for sale. For example, the 1960s saw the new private estate development such as Woodlands Close, Havod Park and Forth Pentre, and such development is still taking place to meet demands from both local people and newcomers to the area. Daniel Owen, 1936 to 1895. Daniel Owen, the Welsh novelist, was the most famous son of Mold and has been described as the Charles Dickens of Wales. He was born in 1836 in Long Row, Maes y Dre, the youngest of 6 children. After his father and 2 brothers were killed in the Argoed colliery flooding disaster in 1837, his mother struggled to bring up the rest of the family. He received only an elementary education and was apprenticed to a local tailor, in whose workshop he became involved in lively discussions about social, political and religious matters with his work colleagues. He was encouraged by the Reverend Roger Edwards, minister of Bethesda Chapel, to become involved in the local Eisteddfod and literary meetings. At the age of 29, Daniel Owen entered Bala Theological College to train for the ministry, but he gave up his course to look after his mother and sister. He started writing in monthly installments for the Calvinistic Methodists periodical Ydrysova, and his reputation grew with the publication of his novels Rhys Lewis, Enoch Hughes, Gwen Thomas and Ydrevlon, as well as his short stories. In his writings he drew heavily on his own personal experiences and local characters he knew in the small, chapel-dominated town in which he lived. His activities were not confined to literature and nonconformity. He served on the local board and was elected to Mold Urban District Council and was its first chairman in 1894. He died in 1895, but is remembered today with a shopping precinct, library and community centre named after him, and a museum depicting aspects of his life and work. A bronze statue of him stands in the town square, with the words in which he summarized his own work inscribed upon it. Not for the wise and learned have I written, but for the common people. John Ambrose Lloyd, 1815 to 1874. John Ambrose Lloyd was born in a house in the Upper High Street in 1815. He is credited with getting nonconformist churches to realize the importance of sacred music in acts of worship. Before then, many churches took the puritanical view that music had no place in the worship of God. He set a very high standard for the Welsh hymn tune and gave it special dignity. His hymns can now be found in the hymnals of most denominations throughout the world. Richard Wilson was born in Penygoes near Machynlleth in 1713. He was related to the Wynn family of Leeswood, and it was in Mold that he spent his childhood. At 16, he went to London to study. In 1750, Wilson went to Italy, where he gained a reputation as a landscape artist. He later became one of the founders of the Royal Academy and its librarian. He returned to Colomendy near Mold in 1781, and during this time he painted his Welsh landscapes. He was regarded as the greatest landscape artist of his day. He's buried in Mold Parish Churchyard, and in the church there's a brass plaque and a stained glass window commemorating his life and work. John Blackwell, 1797 to 1840. John Blackwell, the Welsh poet, better known by his bardic name Alan, was born in Pontywyl, Mold in 1797. Alan's lyrical poetry, especially that in free metre, is a particularly important contribution to Welsh literature, as it marks an early trend towards the Romantic movement. His promising career was cut short by his death at the comparatively young age of 43. Mold as a town is still evolving, and new housing and business developments are in progress. The town has a promising future with excellent facilities not only for shopping, but also for education, leisure and recreation, and is surrounded by easily accessible, attractive, open countryside. It's a pleasant place to live and work, with a promising future which is firmly founded on its long, interesting and proud history. It also has much to offer and fascinate the tourist and visitor.